They said feeding her would cost him everything, and out here in the dry silence of the West men had lost less for far more foolish choices than a single meal. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his failing ranch with the wind dragging dust across the cracked earth like a warning. His boots sank half an inch into powder that used to be soil, and the fence posts leaned as if even wood had grown tired of standing. The sun hung low and mean, stretching shadows long across the skeletons of cattle that hadn't made it through the last heat wave, and somewhere in the distance a loose sheet of tin tapped against a barn wall in a slow, uneven rhythm like a clock that had forgotten what it was counting down to. Ethan hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and even then it had been little more than a strip of dried meat and the last heel of bread he kept wrapped in cloth inside his jacket. Now his hand rested over it, feeling its shape like a man counting his final dollars without needing to look, because he already knew the number. He had stayed when others packed up their wagons and headed east chasing rumors of rain and softer ground. He stayed because this land held his name in ways paper never could, because leaving meant admitting the world had beaten him quiet and permanent, and Ethan Cole wasn't ready to be that kind of man, not yet, not while there was still a fence to mend or a roof to patch or a sunrise to meet, even if it rose over nothing but dust and regret. He turned back toward the house. A small structure of warped wood and stubborn nails. When he saw her at first she didn't look real, just a shape at the far edge of the property where the land dipped slightly toward a dry creek bed, a flicker of movement against the stillness. He narrowed his eyes, squinting through the glare, and took a few slow steps forward, his hand not on a weapon but hovering near his belt. Out of habit more than fear, the figure moved again, smaller than he expected, unsteady like a young colt learning its legs. And then the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and sage and something else, something human and tired. Ethan stopped about 20 yards away, close enough now to see her clearly, a girl no more than 16, maybe younger, her dark hair tangled and dry, her clothes worn thin by travel and sun, and around her neck a small leather pouch tied with cord resting against her chest like it mattered more than anything else. She swayed once, then steadied herself, her eyes finding his and holding. There was no anger in them, no demand, just a quiet kind of exhaustion that said she had already asked the world for too much and gotten nothing back. Ethan felt the weight of the bread inside his jacket grow heavier suddenly, like it knew it was being considered, like it understood what it meant to be the last of anything. The wind died for a moment and the land held its breath, waiting for a decision that would not echo with gunfire or shouted words, but with something quieter, something that would take longer to be understood and cost more than either of them could see. Yet the girl did not step closer, and she did not run either. She simply stood there with the kind of stillness that belonged to someone who had learned the hard way that sudden movements invited the wrong kind of attention. Ethan studied her the way a man studies a storm on the horizon, not looking for beauty but for intention. Her hands were empty, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she had been carrying something heavy for too long and only recently set it down. The leather pouch at her throat caught the light for a brief second, a dull shine worn smooth by time and touch, not decoration, something else, something kept close for a reason he could not yet understand. You are a long way from anywhere, Ethan said, his voice rough from disuse and dry air. The words felt strange in his mouth, like tools he had not picked up in years. She did not answer at first. Her eyes flicked past him toward the house, then the barn, then the empty fields, as if measuring what little there was to take or to fear. When she finally spoke, her English came slow, careful, each word placed like a stone in a shallow crossing. I walked, she said, nothing more, no explanation, no request, just a statement of fact that carried miles of silence behind it. Ethan nodded once, as if that was enough, because out here it usually was. People did not walk without reason, and they did not arrive at a place like his unless every other option had already been stripped away by sun and distance and something less forgiving than both. The wind returned, brushing against his coat and bringing with it the smell of dry grass and old wood. His stomach tightened, reminding him of the bread again, of the small piece of something that still belonged to him alone. He glanced toward the horizon, out of habit, the same empty line where nothing ever appeared unless it was trouble or hope, and most days it was neither, just more sky pressing down on the land. He looked back at her. She had not moved, but there was something in her stance now, a slight sway, a weakness she could not quite hide. Her fingers tightened briefly around the pouch at her neck, then loosened again, as if even that small motion cost her more than she wanted him to see. Ethan took a step closer, slow, deliberate, giving her time to pull away if she chose. She did not. Instead, her eyes held his, steady, dark and unreadable, but not cold. There was something else there, something like waiting, not for help exactly, but for a decision that would tell her what kind of man stood in front of her. Ethan felt the weight in his chest shift, not hunger, not entirely, something older, something that had nothing to do with food or survival and everything to do with the Kind of choices a man carried long after the land forgot his name. He reached into his jacket slowly, his fingers brushing the cloth-wrapped bundle. He paused for just a second, feeling the dryness of it, the thinness, the finality, and in that pause the world seemed to narrow down to the space between his hand and hers. The wind quieted again, the tin on the barn fell still, and even the distant creak of wood faded, as if the land itself had stepped back to watch what he would do next. The cloth came free in his hand with a quiet sound softer than it should have been, as if even it understood the weight of leaving his possession. Ethan held it there between them, not offering it yet not pulling it back either, just letting the moment stretch thin as wire. The girl watched his hand, not with hunger, not the kind that made people desperate and reckless, but with something steadier, something that had learned to wait through worse than an empty stomach. Her eyes flicked up to his face once, then back to the bundle, as if the decision mattered more than the food itself. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air dry in his chest, and he placed the bundle in her hands without a word. Her fingers closed around it carefully, almost gently, like it was not food at all but something fragile, something that could break if treated the wrong way. She did not tear into it, she did not even unwrap it right away. Instead she held it there for a second longer, feeling its weight the same way he had, and in that pause Ethan saw something shift in her expression, not relief, not exactly, something quieter, something that settled deep and stayed. She nodded once, a small motion almost too slight to notice, but it carried more meaning than any thank you he had heard in years. Then she turned slightly away from him and crouched near the edge of the dry creek bed, her movements slow, controlled. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing the bread inside, and broke it into two uneven pieces. She kept the smaller one, Ethan noticed that, without meaning to, and she ate in small measured bites, each one deliberate, as if she was honoring something beyond the simple act of survival. The larger piece she set aside on the cloth beside her, untouched. The wind moved again, lifting a strand of her hair across her face, and she brushed it back with the back of her hand, never taking her eyes off the horizon. As she ate, Ethan shifted his weight, feeling the emptiness in his own stomach deepen. Now that the choice had been made, there was no turning back from it, no second thought that would change anything. The land did not reward hesitation, and it did not forget decisions either. You can rest here tonight, he said after a moment, the words coming easier now that something had been given. You will find water in the barrel by the barn, not much but enough. She looked at him again, and this time there was something different in her gaze, not gratitude, not quite respect, something closer to recognition, as if she had placed him somewhere in her understanding of the world and found him worthy of a certain kind of memory. She finished the small piece of bread and wrapped the rest again, carefully placing it back on the cloth before lifting it. She did not hand it back to him, she simply held it close for a moment, then extended it toward him, the gesture unexpected, quiet, firm. Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion but in the way a man does when the world offers him something he does not believe he deserves. You should keep it, he said, his voice low. She shook her head once, and for the first time there was a hint of something like insistence in her posture, not forceful, not demanding, but certain. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed the wrapped bread back into his hand. Her fingers brushed his, briefly warm despite the wind. And then she stepped back again, her hand moving to the leather pouch at her neck, resting there as if to steady herself or to remember something important. You gave first, she said, her voice still soft but clearer now. I do not take. All the silence that followed was not empty, it carried the weight of something older than either of them, something that did not belong to fences or ownership or even survival. Ethan looked down at the bread in his hand, then back at her, and for the first time since she appeared he felt something shift inside him, not hunger, not doubt, something steadier, something that would stay long after the dust settled. The bread rested in his palm again, lighter than before and somehow heavier at the same time. Ethan closed his fingers around it slowly, as if testing whether it was still real. The girl had already stepped back toward the edge of the property, her posture quiet, composed, the same way it had been when he first saw her. But something had changed in the space between them, something unspoken and settled like dust after a long wind. Neither of them moved for a few seconds, the kind of stillness that does not come from uncertainty but from understanding. The sun dipped lower, pulling the light down into a dull amber that painted everything in soft edges, the broken fence, the sagging barn, the dry creek bed that had not seen water in months. It all looked the same as it had that morning, but it did not feel the same. Ethan turned the bread once in his hand, then walked toward the house, his boots pressing shallow prints into the powdery ground behind him. He did not look back right away, not because he was afraid she would be gone, but because he knew she would be. When he reached the porch he paused, resting one hand on the worn wood of the railing, and finally glanced over his shoulder. The place where she had stood was empty, no footprints clear enough to follow, no movement along the horizon, just the land stretching out the way it always did, wide, indifferent and quiet, as if it had never held anything more than wind and dust. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and stepped inside the house. The air was cooler, but only by a little. The Walls held on to heat the way old memories held on to weight. He set the bread down on the small table near the window, and for a moment he simply looked at it, not as food, not as survival, but as something that had passed between two people and come back changed. He sat slowly, the chair creaking under him, and ran a hand across his face, the stubble rough against his palm, the dryness of his skin reminding him how long it had been since anything in his life had felt uncertain in a way that mattered. Night came without ceremony, the sky turning from gold to deep blue and then to black, dotted with stars that felt closer out here than anywhere else. Ethan lit a small lamp, the flame flickering steady, casting long shadows across the room. The silence returned the same as every other night, but now it carried something else beneath it, a question maybe, or a waiting he could not name. He broke a small piece from the bread and ate it slowly, the taste plain familiar, grounding him in the moment but not erasing what had already been set in motion outside. The wind picked up again, moving through the cracks in the walls with a low steady sound like a distant voice speaking in a language he almost understood. He lay down on the narrow bed, his body tired in a way that came from more than just hunger, and stared at the ceiling. The events of the day did not replay in his mind the way memories usually did. They settled instead like something placed carefully in a corner, not to be forgotten but not to be examined too closely either, not yet, somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the dry fields and the empty horizon. A path had been crossed, a choice had been made, and though the land showed no sign of it, though nothing had arrived and nothing had changed in any way he could see, Ethan Cole knew with a quiet certainty that something had already begun. Morning came slow and thin, the kind of light that did not warm anything it touched. Ethan woke before the sun cleared the horizon, his body already aware of the quiet ache that had settled deeper overnight. He sat up on the edge of the bed and listened. The same sounds as always whined against, with the faint creak of the barn somewhere outside, the soft shifting of loose dirt across the yard. Nothing new, nothing different, and yet something felt off, not wrong, just unfinished, like a sentence that had not reached its final word. He stood and moved toward the table, the remaining piece of bread still wrapped where he had left it. He touched it briefly, then pulled his hand away as if it no longer belonged to him. In the same way he stepped outside, the air cooler now, carrying the faint smell of morning dryness that promised another hard day ahead. The sky stretched wide, pale blue, with no clouds to break its emptiness. He walked the perimeter of the ranch, out of habit, checking posts that leaned more than they should, boards that would need replacing when there was time and strength for it. He paused at the dry creek bed where he had last seen her. The ground held no clear trace of her passing. The wind had taken care of that, smoothing everything back into sameness as if she had never stood there at all. Ethan crouched down, brushing his fingers lightly over the dirt, not searching for tracks, just confirming what he already knew. Some things did not leave marks you could follow. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the steady drain of heat pressing down on the land and everything on it. Ethan worked through the morning, fixing what little he could, tightening wires, straightening a post that leaned too far, the motions familiar, automatic, his body remembering what his mind did not need to think about. By midday the heat settled in, thick and unrelenting. He wiped sweat from his brow and looked out across the empty stretch of land. No riders, no movement, no sign of anything beyond the usual stillness. Day one passed like that, then day two, the same sky, the same wind, the same quiet that stretched long into the night. On the third day his steps slowed just enough to notice. On the fourth he found himself sitting longer between tasks, staring out at the horizon as if expecting something he could not name. The bread grew smaller each time he broke from it, each piece measured not by hunger alone but by how long he believed he needed to stretch what remained. By the fifth day the ache in his body had settled into something dull and constant, no longer sharp enough to demand attention, just present like the land itself. He drank from the barrel sparingly, the water low now, the wood creaking as if it too felt the strain. On the sixth day he woke later than usual, his limbs heavy, his breath slower. He sat on the porch, instead of working, his eyes tracing the same empty line where sky met earth. Nothing arrived. Nothing changed. The wind moved through the yard, lifting dust in small spirals that rose and fell without purpose. Ethan leaned back against the post and closed his eyes for a moment, not sleeping, just resting in the space between effort and surrender. Somewhere in the back of his mind the memory of her remained, not vivid, not insistent, just there, quiet as the land itself, a reminder of something given and something returned, not in equal measure but in meaning. By the time the sun began to set on the sixth day Ethan Cole understood something simple and hard. The land did not promise anything back, not for effort, not for patience, and not for kindness. It only waited, and men either endured it or they did not. And still, as the last light stretched across the empty fields, he found himself looking out once more toward the horizon, not because he expected anything to come but because some part of him refused to believe that what had passed between two strangers could end in nothing at all. The seventh morning did not announce itself with anything new, no shift in the wind, no change in the sky, just the same pale light creeping over the horizon, as if the land had decided that repetition Was all it owed the men who stayed on it. Ethan woke slower than before, his body reluctant to answer a day that promised nothing different. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, letting the silence settle around him. The room felt smaller now, not in size but in weight, as if the air itself had thickened with all the things that had not happened. He stood eventually and moved outside, the porch boards creaking under his boots, the sound sharper in the quiet. He leaned against the post for balance more than habit, his eyes drifting toward the horizon without intention, the same line he had studied for days now, the same emptiness that had answered him each time. The last of the bread had been gone since the night before, and his stomach no longer protested. It had moved past hunger into something quieter, something that simply existed without asking for attention. The barrel by the barn gave a hollow echo when he tipped at the water. Nearly gone, he set it back carefully as if respect alone might keep what little remained from disappearing entirely. The wind picked up just enough to move the dust across the yard in thin wandering lines that erased yesterday and the day before it. Without effort, Ethan stepped down from the porch and took a few slow steps forward, his boots dragging slightly in the dirt, not from weakness alone but from the weight of a decision that had long since been made and could not be undone. He did not regret it, not in the way men regret mistakes. This was something else, something steadier, something that did not ask for return or explanation. It simply was. He reached the edge of the yard and stopped, his gaze fixed on the horizon again. Not searching, not expecting, just looking because there was nowhere else to look. And then it came, not a sound at first, not even movement, something more subtle, a change in the way the light held across the distance, a faint disturbance where the line between earth and sky should have remained clean. Ethan narrowed his eyes, his breath slowing as he focused. There it was, a thin rise of dust far out beyond where any single rider would trouble to travel at this hour, too wide for one, too steady for the wind. He did not move closer, he did not call out, he simply stood watching as the shape grew clearer, not fast, not rushed but certain. The dust lifted higher now, catching the sunlight in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and beneath it faint shapes began to form. At first they were only shadows moving against brightness, then lines, then figures, more than a handful, more than a dozen. Ethan straightened slightly, his hand resting against the post behind him, not for support this time but for stillness, the kind a man uses when he understands that whatever is coming is not meant to be met halfway. The wind shifted, carrying with it a distant rhythm, soft at first, almost imagined, then clearer, the sound of hooves, not hurried, not chaotic but measured, deliberate, like a heartbeat that knew exactly where it was going. Ethan Cole did not step forward, he did not step back, he stood where he was as the dust rose higher and the figures drew closer until the empty horizon was empty no longer, and for the first time in days the land did not feel silent. The riders did not slow as they approached, but they did not rush either, their movement steady, controlled, like men who had already decided how this moment would unfold long before it began. The dust settled gradually behind them, revealing shapes that became clearer with every passing second, horses strong and quiet, their hooves striking the earth in a rhythm that did not break or falter, and on their backs figures upright, still, their presence filling the empty land in a way that made everything else seem smaller. Ethan stood where he was, his shoulders squared, not in defiance but in acceptance, his eyes tracking the line as it stretched wider than he first thought. 10 riders, then 20, then more, until counting stopped mattering because the number itself was no longer the point. They moved as one, not a crowd, not a scattered group but something unified, something that carried intention without needing to speak. The first of them reached the edge of the property and slowed, then stopped. The rest followed in perfect sequence until the movement ended all at once and the land fell quiet again. No voices, no sudden gestures, just the soft shifting of horses and the low sound of leather settling in place. Ethan felt the stillness press in around him, thicker than before, heavier because it held expectation now, not emptiness. He did not reach for anything, not even out of habit. His hands rested at his sides, open, visible, the way a man stands when he understands that whatever comes next will not be decided by force. The riders parted slightly in the center, not abruptly, not with command but with a quiet understanding that passed between them, and through that opening a single figure stepped forward, not on horseback but on foot, moving with a calm that carried its own kind of authority. Ethan recognized her before she came close enough to see clearly, something in the way she walked, something in the way the wind seemed to move around her rather than against her. Nayeli stopped a few steps from him, the same girl and yet not the same. The exhaustion he had seen before was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that belonged to someone who was no longer lost. Her clothing was cleaner now, though still simple, her hair pulled back from her face and the leather pouch still rested against her chest, unchanged, untouched, as if time itself had respected its place between them. She looked at him, not with surprise, not with hesitation but with certainty, as if this moment had been expected from the beginning. Ethan met her gaze, the silence stretching between them, not empty but full of everything that had passed in the days before, the hunger The waiting, the quiet choice that had been made without witness behind her. The riders remained still, their presence filling the space without pressing into it. They did not advance, they did not speak, they simply stood as if the land itself had taken shape and come to rest. At his door Nayeli reached up and touched the pouch lightly, her fingers resting there for a brief moment before she lowered her hand again, her eyes never leaving his. You stayed, she said, her voice clearer now, stronger, not louder but carrying farther in the still air. Ethan gave a small nod, the motion simple, honest. There was nothing else to say about that. She studied him for a second longer, then turned slightly, her hand lifting just enough to signal something to the riders behind her. No words, no command, just a gesture, and it was enough. The line shifted, not forward, not yet, but into something new, something that felt less like an arrival and more like the beginning of an answer to a question he had not known how to ask. Nayeli did not speak again right away. Instead she stepped forward, closing the distance between them until only a few feet of dry earth remained, her presence calm, grounded, like someone who belonged exactly where she stood. Ethan noticed the way the riders behind her shifted. Not forward, not back, but into a wider arc, forming a quiet boundary around the ranch, not enclosing it, not claiming it, just marking a space where something important was about to happen. Nayeli reached for the leather pouch at her neck, her fingers moving with care as if the act itself held meaning beyond what it contained. She untied the cord slowly, the movement deliberate, unhurried, and for a brief moment the wind stilled again, as though even it understood the weight of what was being revealed. She opened the pouch and reached inside, withdrawing a small bundle wrapped in soft worn cloth. The fabric carried faint markings, hand-stitched patterns that spoke of time and memory more than decoration. She held it in both hands for a second, her gaze lowering, not in hesitation but in respect. Then she stepped closer and extended it toward Ethan. He did not take it immediately. His eyes moved from her face to the bundle and back again, measuring not the object but the moment around it. What is this, he asked quietly, his voice steady but softer than before. Nayeli did not answer the question directly. Instead she placed the bundle into his hands, closing his fingers around it with a gentle firmness that left no room for refusal. You gave when there was nothing, she said. Now we return what cannot be counted. In the same way Ethan felt the cloth in his hands lighter than he expected, and yet carrying a weight that did not belong to size or substance. He unwrapped it slowly, careful not to disturb the folds more than necessary. Inside were small things, simple at first glance, seeds dark and dry resting in a neat cluster, a smooth stone etched with faint lines that caught the light in subtle patterns, and beneath them a strip of fabric. Faded but clean, the color soft like something that had been worn close for many years. Ethan looked at them in silence, his mind searching for value in the way he understood it. Water, livestock, tools, things that could be measured and traded. But this was different. This was something else, something that did not fit into the narrow space of survival he had been living in. Nayeli watched him closely, not expecting a reaction, not waiting for gratitude, just observing, as if what mattered was not what he said but what he understood. These are not gifts, she said after a moment, her voice steady. They are a beginning. Behind her one of the riders dismounted, carrying a small sack which he placed gently near the edge of the yard. Another followed, then another, each movement quiet, respectful, until a line of items began to form along the boundary of Ethan's land. Not weapons, not demands, but tools, water, skins, bundles of grain, young plants still rooted in damp soil, carried across miles to reach this place. The riders moved without instruction, each one adding something, until the empty space that had defined the ranch for so long began to shift into something else, something that held promise. Without announcing it, Ethan stood still, the bundle in his hands, the riders before him, the land around him unchanged and yet no longer the same. He looked back at Nayeli, and for the first time there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes that what he gave away was never truly lost and what returned was never meant to be measured at all. No one celebrated and no one spoke louder than the wind that moved softly across the yard, as if it too had learned that some things did not need sound to be understood. The riders did not linger in a way that demanded attention. They moved with purpose, quiet, steady, each man and woman taking a place where they were needed without waiting to be told. One knelt near the broken fence, setting new posts into the ground with careful hands. Another carried water toward the barrel, refilling it not in haste but with patience, as if time itself had stretched to make room for this moment. Ethan stood in the center of it all, the bundle still resting in his hands, the seeds, the stone, the worn strip of fabric. None of it had changed, and yet everything around him had begun to shift in ways he could feel but not yet name. Nayeli watched him for a moment longer, her expression calm, not searching for approval, not expecting gratitude. She gave a small nod, not as a signal but as a quiet acknowledgement. Then she stepped back, allowing the space between them to settle into something new, not distance, Not separation but balance, the kind that does not need to be explained. Ethan moved at last, not toward her but toward the edge of the yard where the first of the tools had been placed. He knelt down slowly, his body still carrying the weight of the past days but steadier now than it had been before. He pressed his fingers into the soil, turning it over once, the dirt still dry, still stubborn, but beneath the surface just an inch down there was a hint of something cooler, something that had been waiting longer than he realized. He looked down at the seeds in his hand, then back at the ground, and without thinking too far ahead he planted them one by one, not in perfect rows, not with careful spacing, just enough to begin the motion, simple, quiet, certain. Behind him the work continued, wood replaced wood, water filled empty space, and the land that had held nothing for so long began to carry small signs of change, a post standing straight, or a shadow where there had been none, a line where there had once been only open dust. The sun climbed higher, casting light across the ranch in a way that felt different, not brighter, not warmer, but fuller, as if it now had something to land on. Ethan stood again, slowly, his gaze moving across the yard, the riders no longer forming a line but blending into the space, part of it rather than apart from it, and at the far edge Naeli had already begun to walk away, not alone but not followed either, her figure steady against the horizon, the same path she had come from, now leading her back into a world he did not need to understand. He did not call out. He did not ask her to stay. Some things were not meant to be held on to, not in the way men tried to hold land or water or time. He simply watched until her shape grew smaller and then disappeared into the distance. The wind moved again, carrying with it the faint scent of something new, not rain, not yet, but the promise of it, the kind that lingers before it arrives. Ethan Cole turned back toward the work without urgency, without doubt. The land was still hard, the days ahead would not be easy, and nothing about what had happened guaranteed anything beyond this moment. But as he walked across the yard, past the barrel now filled, past the fence that stood a little straighter, past the ground where something unseen had already begun to take root, there was a quiet understanding that settled in him, deep and steady. Out here justice did not come with noise or force, it arrived the way everything else did, slow, certain, and carried on the choices a man made when no one was there to see them.